All right, we are back to the neuron, which is the nerve cell. And looking at the neuron here, let's just recap what we already know. This is the cell body, which looks like a regular cell with the nucleus and all the organelles. These are the dendrites, which send information into the cell body. This is the axon, where information is traveling away from the cell body to the axon terminals. What else do we know here? Whether this is gray matter or white matter? Well, we can see that the axon is myelinated with all these little cushions of insulation. Because it's myelinated, we call this white matter. But the purpose of this slide here is neuron polarity. And what that means is information only flows one way in a given neuron. So in this neuron here, information is going from dendrites to cell body and then cell body to the axon, all the way to the ends of the axons, which we call axon terminals. So this is the only way information can travel, right, from dendrites to cell body, down the axon to the axon terminal. And at that point, information has to be relayed to the next cell, whether that's another neuron, whether that's a muscle fiber to make it contract, which we saw in the previous chapter, or actually not the previous, 2 chapters ago. That relay we call a synapse. But that's what polarity means. This is just one-way information. Information cannot move this way, right? Impossible, right? It can only move one way down the neuron, and that's what that information flow is the neuron polarity, the one-way flow. We're still on the neuron, and we see more terms to know. These are more structures on a neuron, so let's make sure we're familiar with these 4 structures now. So the first one, really important, is called an axon hillock, and that's this region right here. You can see it labeled axon hillock. It's the transition area between the cell body and the axon, right? We can see the axon, the wire here, it's myelinated, and we see the cell body here, but this zone, it's kind of a just triangular area right there where we move from cell body to axon. Well, that transition zone is the axon hillock. That's going to be an extremely important location as we move through this chapter, because this right here is where the action potential begins. And an action potential is a nerve impulse. It's electrical impulse that travels down the axon, and here is where it starts. Now, we said that information goes from the dendrites to the cell body. Well, that information flowing here in the cell body and in the dendrites, that's not an action potential. It's called a graded potential, which we're going to get to, which is still electrical information, but it's different from the action potential. So that's going to be our job a little bit further on in this PowerPoint. And I just wanted to bring it up there, so it might not make a whole lot of sense what I just said, but for now, realize, this axon hillock is an important spot, because that's where an action potential, which we'll get to, begins at. Node of Ranvier, these are gaps between segments of myelin. So if we look at these little pieces of myelin, which is a fatty substance, each little section here is actually a cell. It's called a Schwann cell. And then we see these tiny little gaps in between each Schwann cell. That's what a node of Ranvier is. You could say Ranvier or Ranvier, it doesn't matter. But these little gaps are the nodes. Of course, the end of the axon is the axon terminal. And if I were to enlarge an axon terminal right at one of these little tips here, one of these branches, it's going to bulge out at the tip. That's what a synaptic end bulb is. We don't have to get too specific. Typically, I'm just going to refer to the ends of the axon as axon terminals, so I'm not too worried about synaptic end bulb. But if you see that in your book or further on in the PowerPoint, it's just the end of the axon, the end of the axon terminal, or what it's enlarged. But we'll kind of use these terms interchangeably, not a huge deal. Typically, so far, we've been looking at neurons that look like this, right? With dendrites at one end of the cell body and then an axon coming out the other end. This is the structure of most of the neurons in your body. We call that multipolar because there's more than 2, we could say 3 or more than 2 processes, one axon and many dendrites. coming out of the cell body. So since there's more than two processes, we call them multipolar. One axon, a lot of dendrites, most common neuron. It's also majority of your neurons in your central nervous system as well are these multipolar neurons. But what about something that looks like this, right, where you have your cell body and just two processes? So basically one end would be the dendrite, the other end would be the axon. There's still polarity, meaning information just still flows one way from dendrites to cell body to axon, but the cell body only has two processes, one at each end. Well, that's called a bipolar neuron. And that's not very common, and you can see it's rare. Only two very specific spots we see these bipolar neurons: the retina, which is in your eye, the olfactory mucosa, which is your sense of smell. So those are your only two areas where you see these bipolar neurons. Then if you look at this cell body right here, you can see there's only one process coming out of the cell body, which makes it unipolar, uni for one, and typically one side here is the dendrites coming in, and then the axon will come out. So this one process right here is shared by the dendrites and the axon. That's a unipolar neuron, and one very important area of the body, which we're going to see in a future chapter, where we see unipolar would be the dorsal root ganglion. Some other places as well, but this is the only one that's going to make sense in the future. The DRG, dorsal root ganglion. Remember, a ganglion is a whole cluster of cell bodies. There's one cell body, but stack about 1,000 of these on each other, where you're going to have this big bulge where all the cell bodies are grouped together. That's what a ganglion is, right? In the PNS, peripheral nervous system. The CNS, we call it a nucleus, but there's a dorsal root ganglion is our good example of a unipolar neuron.